The Fairy's Midwife. Variations of this story are told throughout Britain and Ireland. Although the names and locations do vary, the stories are remarkably similar in almost every other detail. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. The Fairy's Midwife. Once upon a time, there was a very experienced and lovely old midwife whose skills were greatly sought after by ladies from far and wide. On this one particular evening, she headed to bed early, as for once she appeared to have the evening off and away from the demands of her services, which was a rare thing for her indeed. With any luck, she'd have the whole night off and be free to attend the fair the next day, which was always a treat. She always liked to know what happened to all the many babies she'd delivered over the years, and the fair gave her a chance to meet and greet everyone and find out how they were all doing these days. However, of course, as soon as she dared to think such a thing to herself, her night off was doomed. In the very middle of the night, the midwife was woken by a sharp, loud knock. When she opened the door, the midwife saw an elegant gentleman sat upon a very fine black horse. She could not see the rider's face, for it was obscured by the long hood of his fine black cloak. "Who and where?" asked the midwife curtly, as in her business every second could count if things were going awry. "I cannot say," replied the gentleman, whose voice the midwife didn't recognise, which was odd, because she knew everyone for miles around, having delivered most, if not all of them. "If you ask no more questions and come with me, you shall be paid handsomely with this bag of gold." As if to prove his point, the gentleman jangled the coin purse on his belt. It wasn't the gold that swayed the midwife, though. Rather, it was the melancholic desperation in the stranger's voice. The request wasn't even that strange. Lords of the manor often ended up with little ones that they didn't want known to be theirs. The midwife grabbed her bag from by the door, where she kept it always ready. The gentleman swung up the old midwife onto his horse in one deft movement, and off they galloped into the dark night. The gentleman rode so hard and fast that the midwife soon lost her bearings and had no idea where they ended up. Yet she knew all the routes for miles around. She had to, in order to get to her ladies quickly. Eventually they stopped at a ramshackle hut in the middle of nowhere, and the gentleman lowered the midwife from his horse somewhat less gracefully than before. "Please help her," he said beseechingly. The midwife headed into the hut and was shocked at what she encountered. The place was as noisy as can be, with squealing and shouting and carrying on of all sorts. It was like chaos itself. The hut was as shabby on the inside as it was on the outside, and was filled with more children than anyone could surely possibly have in their lifetime, and they were practically bouncing off the walls. "Shut it and sit down," the midwife told them firmly, and so they did. Every single one of them sat down in an instant and stared at the old midwife, as shocked as she was that they'd actually obeyed. "That's better, children. Now, if your poor mother and I are going to be needing some peace and quiet right now, and would be much obliged if we could get it." Dozens of little heads nodded. For the first time, the midwife really noticed what they looked like, now that they were actually sat still. They had small bodies, narrow faces, turned-up noses, and pointed ears, just like elves or fairies. And it was at that moment that the midwife figured out what was going on. She'd heard tales of this often enough. All midwives had. "Where's your mother?" asked the midwife. Dozens of small hands pointed to a door opposite the one the midwife had entered through. "Thank you, little ones," said the midwife as she walked through the door. Inside the room, a fairy lady lay writhing and moaning in terrible pain, on the tattiest, dirtiest, most threadbare sheets, on the most broken and bent bed the midwife had ever seen. The midwife acted quickly, for she could already tell the time was of the essence if she was to save both mother and child, who were faring very badly. She soothed and sang to the mother as she worked, caring not that she wasn't quite human, for what does that really matter? So skilled and experienced was the midwife that in no time at all she was holding the slippery, squirming, screeching little bundle of joy, who was clearly going to fit right in with all his many brothers and sisters. He even managed to get a little punch in, which caused the midwife's eye to start swelling right away. The exhausted mother pointed to a flask hanging by the chimney. "There's a flask there. Please pass it to me. I need to put a drop of it in each eye of his eyes so he'll settle down." The midwife turned to look and saw the flask, but by the time she'd turned back to it with it in her hand, the poor mother was fast asleep. Happy to be helpful and not wanting to disturb the mother, the midwife decided to place a drop from the flask in each of the child baby's eyes herself. As she unstoppered it, the entire room filled with the sweetest fragrance, as if summer itself had been bottled. As soon as she put a drop in each of the baby boy's eyes, no longer did it appear that she was holding a squirming elven child, but the cutest of all cherubs, who promptly fell straight to sleep. The midwife was amazed and very curious as to what was in the flask. After all, what could possibly calm a child that quickly? Wouldn't it be great if she could let others in on the secret, because all mothers need their rest from their howling babies sometimes, for the sake of their sanity. She gave the contents a really good sniff, trying to work out what was inside, and thinking that she could guess a fair few of the herbal and floral ingredients, set to replace the stopper. As she did so, a little bit of the liquid from around the rim got onto her fingers. She set the child down by its mother, and then rubbed the soothing liquid at her sore and swollen eye, in the hope that it would help dull the pain. As soon as she did that, the midwife gasped in shock, because no longer was the room tatty and bare. Now it was as fine and beautiful a room as she had ever seen. The broken bed was now a four-poster, and the tatty sheets were the finest silver sheets ever. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and the gentleman walked in. "I see your work here is done now, madam." He passed her the promised bag of gold. "Come, allow me to take you back home." The midwife was still so shocked that she followed the gentleman out of the room and down what was now a grand staircase with a huge ballroom where there was a band playing and people dancing, all in the finest clothes. She longed to watch the dancing, but the gentleman took her gently but firmly by the elbow and led the midwife out of the now mansion towards his waiting horse, which the midwife now saw was a fine but terrifying beast, with ruby red eyes and fiery breath. The gentleman swung the midwife onto his horse, and they set off into the last of the night, for dawn was about to break. Soon enough they reached the midwife's home, just before the first rays of sunlight came over the horizon, and the horse and rider vanished as if into thin air. The midwife made herself a cup of tea. It was so early now, there was no point trying to go back to sleep before the fair. As she sat down to drink her tea, though, her body had other ideas, and she drifted off for a moment. On waking, she soon convinced herself that it had all just been a dream, a really weird one, but a dream nevertheless. Off she went to the market as planned, and met with as many people as she could, asking after them and their families. It was what she loved to do, when suddenly she spied the black-cloaked gentleman from the night before, and he was pilfering goods from the stall-holders. Knowing the stall-holders as she did, and not wanting to see them robbed, the midwife stopped the gentleman by placing a hand upon his arm. "Do you mean to make off without paying, kind sir?" "What are you talking about?" the gentleman asked, wide-eyed. "Them things in your pockets. I saw you stealing them. I thought you were better than this. After all, you paid me so well, so why don't you pay these others for their goods and services, eh?" The gentleman's gaze turned cold and steely as he asked, "Good woman, with which eye can you see me?" Too stunned by his question to deter his inquiry, the midwife placed her hand first over one eye and then over the other, so she could honestly answer his question. "This one," she said. The black-cloaked gentleman threw back his cloak, revealing fine garments of Lincoln green and a golden crown upon his head. He reached out to the midwife, and then the next moment she felt something that was both cold like ice and hot like fire hitting her squarely in the eye through which she'd seen him. When she got home after the fair, her eye still aching, she opened the bag of gold she'd been given the night before, only to find that it contained nothing but dried leaves. From that day to this, the midwife has never been able to see with that eye that once beheld the glamour of the fairies. Is now completely blind. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.